I wonder if I went back and read these again, would they still be 5 stars? Hi, welcome, come on in. My name is Aoife and today I am taking you through some of the books that I have given a 5-star rating to across my life so far. I've gotten a little bit more strict with 5-star ratings in the last couple of years, so for some reason there's not going to be a whole lot of books for this section of my life, but I am going to take you through some of the books that I loved so much that I gave top marks to when I was a child and when I was a teenager. There's not exactly 30 books on this list, but there are still quite a couple, so let's get started and not waste any time. First book on the list is one that I think is one of my earliest memories of reading, one of the earliest books that I would have ever read, and it is the Alfie and Annie Rose Big Story book by Shirley Hughes. Alfie and Annie Rose are siblings. I think Alfie in the books is maybe about 3 or 4, and Annie Rose is maybe a 1-year-old. The books kind of chronicle their lives growing up, the games that they play together, their lives with their parents, all of the people that live in the little community that they also live in. There are stories where Alfie accidentally locks himself into the house, where they kind of set up like a little camping ground in the backyard, where Alfie gets a new rain mac and he just wants to go out and show it off to everybody, but it's not raining so he can't wear it. I absolutely adore these books. The illustrations in them are stunning, and they're books that if I ever feel like I need some comfort, I am definitely going to go back to them. Next on the list is not just a book, but it's actually an author, because I'm going to focus on 2 books by one specific author, and that is Roald Dahl. Roald Dahl played a huge role in my childhood. I understand that that might be something similar for a lot of kids who grew up in the UK and in Ireland, that he and his stories formed quite a big amount of our formative years. But for me, there's 2 of his books that specifically jump out. First one is The BFG. This is a story of Sophie, who one night is awakened by the BFG, who is going around to the homes around the orphanage that she lives in. And instead of giving them nightmares like the other giants that do in Giant Country, the BFG comes in and specifically gives you good dreams, good thoughts. And she accidentally sees him one night and he carries her off away to Giant Country, where they are kind of put to the task of getting rid of the other 9 giants who make life miserable for everyone else. The second book of Roald Dahl's that I absolutely love, and it will probably get 5 stars for the rest of my life, is Matilda. This is the first book that I ever remember finishing cover to cover by myself. That's not exactly a quiet feat, for I think maybe I was about 5 or 6 by the time I finished this, for sure. But it's not the smallest of books, and it's quite big going for somebody who's only really starting out to read. But I identified with Matilda so much as a girl who felt like an outsider, who loved reading, who just wanted to learn everything. There was so much about Matilda that I found solace in. Next is again a 1 author 2 book scenario. So many of the other girls of my age group will have absolutely worshipped the ground that Jackie Wilson walks on. If she said jump, we would have said how high. There's 2 specific books that will always stand out for me when I think back about Jackie Wilson. Of course, there's loads of other ones that I could have gone into, but there's 2 specific ones that I resonate with so much. First one is Tracy Beaker. I think every girl in the UK who's around my age had their Tracy Beaker phase of watching the CBBC show, of reading all the books, of wishing that they lived in the dumping ground for some reason, of trying to battle their own Justine. I think there was just something special about Tracy, how much of a little rebel that she was at times and how much of a troublemaker she could have been. And there's so many things about her that I loved. I also absolutely adored that a couple of years ago we got to see Tracy as a grown-up, as having her own child, what she's like as a mother, how her life has turned out. I absolutely love that Jackie Wilson brought us back into Tracy's world, not just with the books, but also there's been a whole TV show following Tracy and her daughter. The other Jackie Wilson book that I'm going to mention is Double Act. When I was younger, I always wanted a sister, and not just one sister, I wanted a twin sister. I was maybe high-key obsessed with Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen, and I think I just pictured having a twin as the pinnacle of being a human. All I wanted was a twin sister who I could share clothes with, who I could play games with, who I could share books with, just have what I imagined to be a normal twin sibling experience. So, because I wasn't blessed with having a twin when I was born, I had to live vicariously through Mary Kate and Ashley, through other twin media, but mostly through Double Act. What I loved was that Ruby and Garnet really started out the book as just one person, Ruby and Garnet. But by the end of the book, you're seeing so much more of Garnet's personality in particular, that she's striking out by herself, she's going off to boarding school on her own, making her own friends, doing her own thing. And yes, Ruby did rebel a little bit by the end of the book, but I do think that it brought their relationship a lot closer together. Another book that I would have given top marks to when I was a child is The Better Brown Stories by Alan Alberg. This is a kind of a weird one to explain, so walk with me a little bit here. You're following the Brown family, who are characters in the story, but they're not entirely happy with how their story is going. They decide that what they're going to do is they're going to have it out with the writer. He lives in a little shed at the bottom of his mother's garden, and he heads there every morning with his coffee and with his paper, and he just puts his thoughts out into the world. So the Brown family turn up on the doorstep and tell him that they're not super happy with how their narrative is going. They want something a little bit more adventurous, something a bit more exciting, and they give him loads of ideas. I didn't necessarily get all of the references when I was like 6 or 7 years old, but we're talking about the wooden horse of Troy, about like missing children on cartons of milk, kind of like the video to Coffee and TV by Blur. And you're also getting like a flash forward of the oldest Brown child when she is a teenager and what life is like for her. And there's also kind of like a reimagining of the Famous Five with the youngest Brown child. I love that book so much. It really puts all of these ideas right on their heads and makes them so much more entertaining. I know that there's a copy of it at my parents' house. I know that when I go back next month, I'm going to absolutely curl up with a coffee and with that book and just fly through it. The last book that I loved when I was a child is not necessarily a book, but more so an entire series. I've never heard of anyone else who has read these, so if you have, drop me a line. I was obsessed with the Angel Academy series by Annie Dalton. These follow Mel Beebe, who is in a car accident on her 13th birthday and dies. She is brought to heaven, where she is entered into the Angel Academy, where she and her friend Lola, who's from, I believe, New York City, and there's another guy whose name completely escapes me. I think it was Matthew, but that might be incorrect. They all team up together and go back into the past and fight crimes. And I'm talking about that past. We've got like Joan of Arc eras, we've got the 1600s, you've got like the Titanic Edwardian era. I was obsessed with this series. I have never seen it again since. I think I would have gotten it from like the Book People book catalogue. My dad used to sign up to those all the time. And we were always allowed to pick out like 2 books every couple of months. And I got maybe the first 4 books of the series. I've no idea where they are anymore. I don't even know if they're in the house anymore, but if they are, I am going to rip through them. Let's go on now to my teenage years. So the books that I loved between the ages of 10 and 19. A lot of people kind of dip out of reading in these years, whereas I had moments where I dipped in and out. I didn't read as vividly as I would have nowadays, but I also didn't completely forget the books existed. The first book on the list is Under the Hawthorn Tree by Marita Conlon McKenna, and that's going to be a stand-in for the entire 3 books of the series. They are set around the famine time, so 1845 to 1849 in Ireland, and they follow 3 children, Eilidh, Peggy and Michael, whose parents have perished in the famine, their baby sister has perished in the famine, and they leave the family home in search of 2 aunts of their mothers that they know live a little bit further across the country. I can vividly remember sitting in class listening to my teacher reading this book, and when I say vividly, I can remember her saying an exact sentence and where I was sitting in the classroom. Please don't ask me what I had for dinner last night though. The book kind of started me being a little bit of a Republican socialist in Ireland, And it's a really great story of emigration. It will teach you so much about Ireland's history during that time, how people coped, how people survived, how quite a lot of people actually didn't survive, and what Ireland has become ever since. I absolutely love these books. In a somewhat similar vein, another book that I loved when I was probably about that same age is The Hiring Fair by Elizabeth O'Hara. This follows Sally and Katie, who are 13 and 11. It's set in, I think, a little bit later on, around 1890, when the idea of home rule in Ireland was being discussed and being brought up again and again. And there are references to home rule and to Charles Stewart Parnell, who was the politician kind of leading that cause. Sally and Katie live in Donegal, which is in the very, very north of Ireland, and their father has died in a fishing accident. So to make sure that their family survives, Katie and Sally are sold at a local market fair as kind of scullery maids, kitchen maids, nannies, kind of like a dog's body in the house for well-to-do families in different locations. It just so happens that the families know each other very well. I think they were either neighbours or cousins or worked in the same areas or some kind of connection that they had with each other. So Katie and Sally could still see each other once a week. But just like Under the Hawthorn Tree, this was such a great look at Ireland's history at the time. And it really got me interested in Irish history as a whole, these two books. So I have so much to thank them for. If we're going to keep talking about history, then let's spread it out a little bit further. One of my favourite books of all time is a book that I read when I was roughly 18 or 19. I am still to this day a huge fan of The Book Thief by Markus Zusak. It's one of my favourite books of all time. The Book Thief is set in World War II Germany under the Nazi regime, and you're following Liesel Memminger, who comes to live with the Huberman family in a small town called Mölking, which I believe is a fictional place but set in the south of Germany. Liesel is kind of developing a love for writing, for reading, for the written word, but it's not very easy to come across literature at the moment, considering quite a lot of books have been banned or have been publicly burned. So it is a little bit difficult for her to actually satisfy this need that she's getting. So, as the title may suggest, she steals 3 books over the course of the story's narrative. The first one happens right at the start when her brother passes away. The next one, she kind of acquaints herself with the mayor's library in a way she probably shouldn't. And there are lots of other people from across the town that also appear in this book. There's her cantankerous foster mother. There is her pure of heart, purer than the driven snow foster father. There is Rudy, who is, I think, her neighbour, and he's also in the same class as her. And he's the most gentle child I think I've ever read about. The Book Thief is one of those very few books that has gotten me to cry by the end of it, and it destroys me every single time I've read it. Go and pick it up. When I think back to the books that I would have read and loved as a teenager, there are 2 specific series that stand out to me more than any others. First up is The Princess Diaries by Meg Cabot. I wanted to be Mia. I think what I mean by that is that I wanted to be next in line for the throne of a small European principality. Turns out I'm actually doing okay without having that, thank you. The books follow Mia, who at the start of the series is 14, and as you get towards the end of it is 18 years old. And her parents are separated. She hasn't had a whole lot of contact with her dad throughout her life. But when she is 14, he comes back to New York and tells her that she is second in line to the throne of a small European country. What follows is Mia needing to learn an entirely new way of life. How to compose herself when she is around dignitaries, what kind of cutlery she should use at a dinner party, how to speak French, as the film puts it, how to put on pantyhose, all while trying to juggle just the daily struggles of being a teenager. Failing algebra, falling in love with her best friend's older brother, not feeling like she's one of the most wanted and most popular girls in the school. There are some of Mia's kind of trials and tribulations that I do look back on and think, really, girl? But overall, Mia is going to have a very strong place in my heart for quite some time to come. The second book series that pretty much defined my teenage years is the Georgia Nicholson Diaries by Louise Renison. Georgia is kind of the human embodiment of head empty, no thoughts, just vibes. She is the leader of the Ace Gang, who is just a group of friends that Georgia has had throughout her life. She is in school, her parents are happily together, she's got a younger sister named Libby and a cat named Angus. I absolutely loved watching Georgia grow up. There are some points of the book that have aged like milk, but overall, I absolutely adored these books. I really loved Georgia and Dave the Laugh together, and I sometimes think about whether or not they would still be together, whether Rosie and Sven are still together, if the Ace Gang ever still hang out anymore. It was the kind of friendship that I always wanted when I was a teenager. One of the standalone books that I loved so much when I was a teenager is Candy by Kevin Brooks. This book follows Joe, who falls in love with Candy, a teenage prostitute who is addicted to heroin and is very much under the thumb of Iggy, who is her pimp. The book follows their entire, pretty much ill-fated relationship right from the moment that they meet. They go on a adorably cute date to the zoo and look at the penguins together, which completely captured my heart when I was younger. But as you can imagine, there's also quite a lot of struggles going on, not just for Candy, but also for Joe as he gets more and more wrapped up in her world. There are quite some pretty dire consequences for this. There's a lot of kind of subterfuge and action in this book, and I always intend to go back and reread this one. I know I've got a physical copy at my parents' house. I've also got a copy of it on my Kindle because I just never want to be without it. Someday I'm going to have to bite the bullet, but I am just terrified that I'm going to go into it and it's not going to hit the same. Another book that I think if my parents knew I was reading, I would be sent straight to prison, is Always the Bridesmaid by Sarah Webb. This is the first ever kind of contemporary chick lit women's fiction book that I remember reading. I would have found my mom's copy of it when I was maybe 12 or 13. There were a lot of kind of adult themes in this book. I think that it's the first time I ever heard what a condom was. And also the idea that you can get flavored condoms had come up in that book. And that was a journey for Aoife when she was 12 years old. The book follows Amy, who is working in a children's bookshop. And all of her friends around her are starting to get married. Her ex-boyfriend is getting married to the woman that he left Amy for. Her best friend Beth and Tony are also planning their wedding. And just when she thinks that she's hit the brink of it, her 24-year-old sister comes home from Australia with her new fiancé in tow. All of this is happening while Amy is about to turn 30. And there's a whole romance going on here with a lovely children's book author that comes into the shop that Amy works in. It's got slight You've Got Mail vibes, but I absolutely loved this book. One of the big reasons that I loved this book when I was younger is that one of Amy's dreams was to work as a children's presenter on an Irish children's television program that unfortunately isn't running anymore. But even just having that little kind of connection to my life just kind of made the transition from children's books to adult books a little bit smoother. Now on to the final category, which is books that I loved when I was in my 20s. So from the age of 20 up to 29. Already when I started filming this video, I went, oh my God, there's another one I forgot. So I am 95% certain I'm going to be sitting at my desk editing this video and yet another one is going to come to my head. But we will keep going with where we are already. First up is a YA book that I wish was around when I was actually a teenager. It is Asking for It by Louise O'Neill. This was published in 2015, I think, which is when I was 23. And if it had been 5 years earlier, 6 years earlier, it would have had an absolute avid audience with me. This book follows Emma, who is a very popular teenager living in a small village in County Cork. There is a party one evening in her town and she attends, wakes up the next morning on her parents' lawn, no idea how she's gotten there, but she does remember that something happened at the party she's not entirely on board with. The book opens up so many discussions about victim blaming, slut shaming, the whole concept of he said and she said, hearsay. It also has a really great discussion about sports stars, how much of a pedestal we can put them on, how we view them kind of godlike in our eyes, that they can't do any wrong. And when something comes along to challenge that idea, how willing to buy into it are we? I remember vividly when I went home to my parents in July of 2019, myself and two of my friends from school went to see a play of this in the Everyman Theatre in Cork. When the play ended, there was about 10 seconds of just dead silence as everything sank in with everybody who was watching it. And then the standing ovation is just something that I have never seen before. It did also render the three of us completely speechless for about 5 minutes after we left the theatre, so you can imagine just how much of an impact it's going to make. Next up is another book that tackles quite heavy themes, and that is The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. I'm often quite reluctant to give my thoughts on this book because it is absolutely not my narrative. I am not a black person. I do not live in the US. I've never been subjected to racial violence. I've never been threatened at knife point or gunpoint. But the book did still absolutely resonate with me. It gave me quite a lot to sit back on and to think about. And I reread it in 2020 when the Black Lives Matter protests were happening in the US, when everything with George Floyd and with Breonna Taylor was coming out from the US. And it hit so much differently at that time, knowing that violence and racial violence in the US was really starting to hamper up a lot, and that we were seeing a lot more of it in the media. Going back to read Star's story and how her friend had been murdered by a police officer just for reaching out for a hairbrush, it impacted me in a way that I often find difficult to describe. Angie Thomas is also a phenomenal writer. I have read On the Come Up as well, which is a different series but set in the same world as The Hate You Give. And I've also got a copy of Concrete Rose, which is a kind of a prequel to The Hate You Give and follows Maverick, who stars father. And I am mesmerized by her writing every single time I pick them up. This book is a kind of a special one for me because it is the first ever advanced reader copy that I got when I was really starting to get into book blogging. I started properly putting myself forward in about 2016, which is around the time that My Map of You by Isabel Broom came out. My Map of You is set in Greece, it's Isabel's debut, and it follows a woman named Holly whose aunt has passed away and has left her a summer house on the island of Zakynthos. Holly then goes over to Zakynthos to clear out the house, clear up any kind of loose ends that her aunt has left behind, and she bumps into a man from Ireland named Aidan who helps her to discover not just the island, but a couple of family secrets that Holly never knew about. One thing that I will say that I don't love about this book is that there is a slight infidelity narrative running towards it, but other than that, it was such a great debut. It's got a little special place in my heart just because it was not just Isabel's first book, but my very first advanced copy, and I treasure it because of that reason. The next book that I gave 5 stars to is again representative of an entire series, and that is the Oh My God, What a Complete Aisling series by Sarah Breen and Emer McLysett. Aisling started out her life as a character created by the two girls while they were living together in Dublin while they were studying, and she has just expanded so much from there. It started out as a Facebook group, but is now pretty much a cultural phenomenon in Ireland. When I left Ireland in 2017, plans were being put forward to give Aisling a book. It initially started its life as kind of like a quotey coffee table book that you would see in people's homes, but Sarah and Emer felt like Aisling deserved her own novel, and I absolutely agree with this. In the first book, Aisling breaks up with her long-term boyfriend John, moves to Dublin for a new career, makes brand new friends, and is then brought back home when tragedy strikes. This tragedy is definitely something that they are writing from personal experience, and you can absolutely see all of that coming towards the pages. All of the grief, all of the pain, Everything that they would have gone through in real life is captured so phenomenally in these books. And there are a couple of other maybe difficult topics that the books discuss overall. It discusses the idea of men's mental health and how we don't really view that as as serious a problem as women's mental health can be. The idea of homesickness when you have moved away, which is definitely something I can relate to. And I just get so much comfort out of this series. If I'm ever missing home in any way, these are the number one cure. Next on the list is one of my all-time favourite Irish authors. I reread this book at the start of the year and it was still a 5-star read, so you can tell this one is going to endure. This is Rachel's Holiday by Marion Keyes, and it follows the titular Rachel, who is living in New York and is pretty much living a high-octane life. She is out partying every night, she is drinking excessively, she is taking cocaine, and one night she accidentally overdoses and leaves a note that has slight tendencies of a suicide note. Her roommates find this, contact her family, and the next thing Rachel knows, she's woken up in a hospital in New York. Her parents are standing over her bed, and they tell her that they're bringing her back to a rehab centre in Ireland so that she can get rid of her demon. What follows is a really heartfelt look at addiction in Ireland, mental health issues, abuse, other different types of addiction, not just drug abuse, but also alcohol, physical abuse, domestic abuse. Everything in this book is dealt with so much tact, with so much heart from Marion. You can tell that this is a book that's quite personal to her, and I absolutely ate it up. At the start of the year, Again Rachel, which is the sequel to this, came out, and I hopped on it the instant it arrived through my post box. Finished it up in maybe a day and a half, and so far it's in the running for one of my top books of the year. Then we come to the final book on the list. As of today, as of right this second, if you were to ask me, this is my favourite book of all time. The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This was my very first of Taylor Jenkins Reid books. I know it's not the first that she's written. I know she's got other books in her back catalogue that I still need to check out. But this was such a phenomenal introduction to her works. Monique is a young journalist and she is given the assignment of interviewing Evelyn Hugo, a reclusive starlet who was incredibly popular as a movie star back in the 1950s. Evelyn has pretty much disappeared from public life, but she's giving one final interview to Monique and she's going to tell her everything. She's going to tell her the story of her rise to stardom, how her humble beginnings brought her to where she is now, and of course, the story of the 7 husbands that she had throughout her life and who the true love of her life really was. I picked this up just before I went on a little kind of trip around Central Europe a couple of years ago. I started it on the plane, started it completely afresh, and as soon as I got to Vienna, dropped off my bags at my Airbnb, headed out for the city centre, found a cafe, I think it was a McDonald's, and just sat and finished it. I could not get this book out of my head. I've given it to a couple of friends as recommendations and all of them have absolutely adored it. I haven't read this one again yet because I'm a little bit concerned that I might not love it as much. As it stands right now, this is my favourite book of all time. Across my life, those are some of the books that I have given a 5-star rating to. What books have you given a 5-star rating to throughout your whole life? Don't forget to like and subscribe because I have new videos up every week. Now, get on out of here.